Hey guys, tonight we begin with a bucket. Not a throne, not a law, not even a particularly dignified object. Just a clay chamber pot sitting in the corner of a medieval bedroom, waiting for someone to trip over it in the dark. That bucket represents something historians rarely discuss: the entire invisible architecture of nighttime behavior in the Middle Ages. The curfew bell rings at 9, everyone retreats indoors, and suddenly you're left with the most basic human question imaginable. What happens when you need to pee and there's no bathroom, no plumbing, and absolutely no privacy? This isn't about what the law said. It's about what people actually did when the sun went down and social surveillance theoretically ended. The medieval night created a weird paradox where private behavior became the ultimate test of quiet social control. No guards checked if you washed your hands. No magistrate verified you emptied your chamber pot properly. No priest monitored whether you changed your undergarments. Yet somehow, mysteriously, most people followed unspoken hygiene rules anyway. Not because anyone forced them, but because invisible social systems made certain choices feel inevitable. Here's where it gets interesting. The hygiene practices people followed after curfew reveal more about medieval power structures than any law code ever could. These weren't rules written in books or enforced with fines. They were behavioral patterns transmitted through shame, gossip, reputation management, and the constant terror of being the person everyone whispered about. Medieval people engineered social control so sophisticated it didn't require enforcement. They just made non-compliance feel worse than death. Modern privacy has made us forget how recently humans lived without it. Your great-great-great-grandmother probably shared a bedroom with 6 other people, kept a chamber pot under the bed, bathed maybe 3 times per year, and considered clean underwear a luxury. None of this was law. All of it was custom. And customs, it turns out, are far more powerful than legislation because they live inside your head rent-free, whispering what good people do and what disgusting people do, making you police yourself more effectively than any constable ever could. The medieval curfew system created the perfect laboratory for behavioral engineering. Lock everyone indoors after dark, remove external surveillance, and watch what invisible rules still get obeyed. Turns out, humans will follow incredibly specific hygiene rituals even when nobody's watching, as long as the social consequences of getting caught later feel unbearable. Medieval Europe stumbled into one of history's most elegant control mechanisms entirely by accident. They didn't need bathroom police, they just needed neighbors who remembered everything. Before we spend the next 2 hours exploring medieval chamber pot etiquette and the quiet tyranny of unwashed sheets, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this sounds like the kind of historical deep dive that speaks to you. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and whether it's currently a respectable hour or if you're pulling an all-nighter. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, pour something warm to drink, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey through medieval hygiene and the invisible rules that governed it. The curfew bell didn't just signal bedtime. It created an entirely new category of human experience: enforced privacy. Before the medieval period, most people lived in homes where privacy was physically impossible. One room, one hearth, entire families sleeping in shared beds with servants and animals nearby. The concept of alone time simply didn't exist for most of human history. Then European cities introduced curfews, ringing bells at sunset to warn everyone indoors, and suddenly you had mandatory private hours, where external surveillance theoretically stopped. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. The rule was simple. When the bell rings at 9, extinguish all open flames to prevent the nightly inferno that medieval cities were perpetually 3 sparks away from becoming. But the psychological effect was far more complex. The curfew created a temporal boundary between public performance and private behavior, between the person you presented to the community and whoever you actually were behind closed doors. For the first time in history, large numbers of people experienced regular, unsupervised hours. Medieval authorities absolutely panicked about this. Church officials worried that darkness plus privacy equaled sin. City magistrates feared that unsupervised time meant crime, conspiracy, and general moral decay. Tavern owners complained that curfews destroyed their business model, which depended entirely on people making terrible decisions after dark. But the real revolution wasn't what authorities feared would happen during curfew hours. It was what actually happened, which was mostly mundane bodily maintenance that nobody wanted to discuss in daylight. The curfew created the first widespread need for private hygiene infrastructure. When everyone retreats indoors at sunset and stays there until dawn, you can't exactly pop outside to the communal latrine every time nature calls. Suddenly, every household needs some kind of indoor waste disposal system, which in medieval terms meant a bucket. The humble chamber pot became the defining technology of nighttime life, more essential than candles, more ubiquitous than beds, and far more carefully regulated by social custom than any law. Here's the twist. Nobody legislated chamber pot etiquette. There were no royal decrees about proper emptying procedures or city ordinances about where to store your night soil until morning. Yet every medieval person learned incredibly specific, unwritten rules about acceptable chamber pot behavior. You learned them the same way you learned not to cough in someone's face or not to smell other people's food before they ate it. Through a complex system of disgust reactions, social censure, and the constant awareness that your neighbors would absolutely remember and discuss any hygiene failures. The curfew system accidentally created humanity's first widespread experience with self-policed private behavior. During daylight hours, social surveillance was constant. Neighbors watched from windows, priests monitored behavior in churches, guild members observed each other at work. But after the curfew bell rang, external eyes theoretically disappeared. The genius of medieval social control was making people internalize those eyes so completely that surveillance continued even in darkness. You didn't wash your hands after using the chamber pot because anyone checked. You did it because you'd internalized the horror of being discovered as the person who didn't. Medieval records occasionally mention curfew violations, usually involving drunk nobles stumbling home after midnight or merchants bribing guards to move goods after dark. But almost no records discuss nighttime hygiene practices, which tells you everything. Hygiene was too mundane, too private, too shameful to document. It lived entirely in the realm of unspoken custom, transmitted through mothers teaching daughters and fathers warning sons, always framed as what decent people do versus what animals do. The absence of written rules about nighttime hygiene proves how effectively social control operated. You don't need laws when everyone's already policing themselves. The truly remarkable thing is how specific these unwritten rules became. Every household developed elaborate rituals around chamber pot management, bed curtain etiquette, and nighttime washing. Children learned that certain behaviors were acceptable in darkness but never in light, creating this weird dual consciousness where people maintained different hygiene standards depending on who might witness them. Medieval nighttime privacy wasn't freedom. It was just a different, more insidious form of control, where the watcher lived inside your own head, judging every choice you made in the dark. Medieval chamber pots weren't just containers. They were the centerpiece of an elaborate social performance where everyone pretended bodily waste didn't exist while simultaneously obsessing over proper disposal protocols. Every household owned at least one chamber pot, usually placed strategically under beds or in corners, and absolutely nobody ever mentioned this fact in polite conversation. The chamber pot existed in a strange quantum state where it was simultaneously essential to survival and completely invisible to social acknowledgement. The pots themselves reveal class divisions more clearly than any sumptuary law. Peasant families used rough clay vessels, often cracked and poorly glazed, holding perhaps a liter of night soil. Wealthy households invested in ceramic chamber pots with handles and lids, sometimes even decorated with pastoral scenes, because nothing says sophistication like urinating into a hand-painted meadow. The very wealthy owned pewter or silver-chased pots, stored in special wooden commodes that disguise their function. Privacy through expensive furniture, the medieval version of executive bathrooms. But here's where it gets weird. Despite being universal household items, chamber pots lived under an elaborate code of silence. You didn't talk about emptying them. You didn't acknowledge their existence when guests visited. You certainly didn't discuss what happened when someone kicked one over in the dark, though, given medieval bedroom layouts and lighting conditions, this happened constantly. The social rule was simple. Chamber pots are invisible. Everyone uses them, nobody mentions them, and anyone who violates this silence gets branded as vulgar. The disposal ritual was equally theatrical. Every morning, someone, usually the lowest status household member, carried the chamber pot outside to dump in the cesspit, street gutter, or nearest river. This had to happen before the streets filled with respectable people, creating a narrow window of socially acceptable waste disposal time. Cities developed unwritten schedules where everyone knew that between dawn and 6 o'clock, certain alleys would temporarily smell like human sewage, and polite people just pretended not to notice. London developed a particularly elegant solution to the chamber pot problem: the night soil men. These were professional waste collectors who traveled through streets before dawn, emptying household buckets into larger barrels and carting everything to collection points outside city walls. They were paid pittance, treated as untouchable, and absolutely essential to urban hygiene. Their existence reveals medieval society's genius for creating elaborate service economies around functions nobody wanted to acknowledge. Don't want to discuss waste management? Fine. Just pay someone invisible to handle it. The really fascinating development was how chamber pot etiquette became a class marker. Nobles and wealthy merchants developed elaborate euphemisms for these objects. They weren't chamber pots, they were night vessels or Jordans or close stools, depending on region and construction. The language created distance from the function, letting wealthy people pretend their waste management was fundamentally different from peasant waste management. Spoiler, it wasn't. Same bucket, fancier denial. Medieval advice literature, the bits that survived, occasionally hints at proper chamber pot protocols. One household manual from 14th century Florence suggests that guests should never acknowledge hearing chamber pot use in adjacent rooms, creating this absurd fiction where everyone pretends the basic biological functions happening 6 feet away through thin walls simply don't exist. Another source recommends placing herbs in chamber pots to mask odor, because nothing says civilization like making your urine smell like rosemary. The chamber pot system also created interesting architectural innovations. Wealthy homes began incorporating small closets or alcoves specifically for nighttime waste, the medieval version of powder rooms. These weren't bathrooms in any modern sense, just tiny spaces where you could maintain the illusion of privacy while using a bucket. Some castles even had stone seats built into wall alcoves, with chutes dropping waste directly into moats or rivers below. Medieval plumbing was basically gravity plus optimism. But for most people, chamber pot management remained a daily negotiation between bodily necessity and social shame. You needed the pot. Everyone needed the pot. But admitting you needed the pot violated invisible rules about proper behavior. So medieval people developed this elaborate dance of knowing without acknowledging, using without mentioning, managing waste while pretending waste management was beneath their dignity. It was psychological contortionism powered by pure social anxiety. The chamber pot represents everything brilliant and insane about medieval social control. Nobody passed laws about proper disposal. No guards checked whether you emptied your pot correctly. No churches preached sermons about chamber pot sin, though they probably should have, given what ended up in the streets. Yet everyone followed incredibly specific protocols anyway, because the alternative was becoming the person whispered about as unclean, the household where proper customs weren't observed, the family that needed to be reminded about basic decency. Social pressure accomplished what legislation never could. If you think medieval people avoided bathing because they didn't know better, you'd be wrong. They avoided bathing because they knew exactly what happened when you gathered groups of people, water, and nakedness in the same location. Specifically, they knew it led to what church officials delicately called inappropriate congress, which was medieval code for everyone having sex in the bathhouse while pretending to pursue hygiene. Public bathhouses thrived in medieval Europe until about the 15th century, particularly in German and Italian cities. These weren't Roman-style monuments to engineering, but smaller community spaces where neighbors gathered weekly for scrubbing, soaking, and, according to horrified chroniclers, pretty much every sin imaginable. Mixed-gender bathing was common, nudity was expected, and somewhere between the steam and the social atmosphere, hygiene stopped being the primary objective. Church authorities absolutely lost their minds over this. Bathhouses represented everything they feared about unsupervised bodies and public flesh. Sermons railed against mixed bathing as the devil's fishbowl, a place where Satan collected souls through the dangerous combination of warm water and exposed skin. Some priests claimed that bathhouse steam opened the pores of the soul, making it easier for demonic possession. Medical logic and theological panic converged into perfect hysteria. The breaking point came in the mid-15th century when various scandals involving nobles, bathhouses, and very public indiscretions gave authorities the excuse they needed. Cities began restricting bathhouse hours, separating genders, or banning mixed bathing entirely. Some regions shut down public baths altogether, claiming they spread disease and moral decay. The Black Death provided convenient cover for this moral panic, though plague had nothing to do with bathing and everything to do with fleas. Never let epidemiology interfere with a good excuse to regulate bodies. Here's where it gets interesting from a hygiene perspective. Once public bathhouses vanished or became restricted, weekly bathing essentially stopped for most people. The alternative was bathing at home, which required heating massive amounts of water over open flames, hauling it to a wooden tub, and somehow maintaining privacy in one-room houses. Unsurprisingly, most people decided bathing wasn't worth that effort. The result? Medieval hygiene collapsed, not because people were ignorant, but because authorities feared sexuality more than they valued cleanliness. The church tried to solve this by promoting spiritual cleanliness over physical hygiene. Prayer and fasting could purify the soul, they argued, making actual bathing somewhat unnecessary. Some monastic orders even banned bathing as a form of mortification, though they usually exempted the sick and elderly, because even medieval asceticism had limits. The idea was that physical discomfort brought you closer to God, which conveniently also meant nobody had to build expensive bathhouses anymore. Wealthy households maintained private bathing capacity, creating yet another class division. Nobles could afford servants to heat water, carry tubs, and maintain the infrastructure of regular washing. Peasants got told that dirt was good for you, and bathing was suspiciously Roman. The wealthy bathed and lectured the poor about spiritual purity. The poor didn't bathe and got lectured about their smell. Medieval class dynamics summarized through soap access. The bathing panic created interesting substitutes for actual hygiene. Wealthy people began using perfumes, scented powders, and elaborate clothing changes to mask body odor rather than addressing its source. The perfume industry exploded precisely when bathing collapsed, creating an entire economy based on disguising the consequences of not washing. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew they smelled. They just decided expensive fragrance was more socially acceptable than naked bathing. Personal hygiene after curfew became an exercise in creative compromise. You couldn't visit a bathhouse after dark, even if they were still operating. Public baths closed with the curfew bell. So, nighttime washing meant cold water in a basin, quick face and hand scrubbing, and strategic cloth usage for parts that absolutely required attention. The wealthy might have servants warm small amounts of water for bedroom washing. Everyone else made do with whatever they could tolerate. Medieval people developed elaborate theories about when washing was necessary versus dangerous. Morning washing was considered healthy, removing the night's vapors. Washing before bed risked opening pores to nighttime miasmas. Washing too frequently weakened the body's natural protective layer of filth, which, yes, was an actual medieval medical theory. Basically, find any excuse to avoid the massive effort of heating water and hauling tubs, then call it health science. The really insidious part was how bathing avoidance became moralized. Regular bathing started being associated with vanity, luxury, and suspiciously Roman habits. People who bathed frequently got labeled as vain, shallow, possibly heretical. Meanwhile, visible dirt became proof of piety, showing you cared more about your soul than your body. The church accidentally convinced an entire continent that smell was next to godliness, as long as it was the smell of unwashed peasants pursuing salvation. This created perfect conditions for invisible social control through shame. You didn't need bathing laws. You just needed everyone to believe that too much bathing revealed moral weakness. The person who insisted on regular washing became suspect, possibly proud, definitely difficult. The person who embraced strategic filth proved their spiritual priorities. Medieval hygiene norms policed themselves through reputation management far more effectively than any legislation could. But the chamber pot and the abandoned bathhouse were just infrastructure. The real control mechanism was something far more subtle, lurking in the darkness of medieval bedrooms where privacy supposedly reigned. Because after curfew, when external eyes closed, internal surveillance opened wider than ever. Medieval bedrooms make modern studio apartments look like palatial estates. Most families lived in single-room dwellings where sleeping, cooking, eating, storage, and animal housing all occurred in the same space. Privacy was a theoretical concept invented by wealthy people and completely unknown to everyone else. When night fell and curfew bell rang, you didn't retreat to your private chamber. You shared a bed with 4 siblings, 3 feet from your parents, surrounded by whatever livestock you owned, while servants or extended family occupied the same room. The bed itself reveals social hierarchy more clearly than any org chart. Wealthy households owned massive frame beds with elaborate carvings, thick mattresses stuffed with wool or feathers, and most importantly, curtains. Bed hangings were the medieval version of walls, creating a portable room within a room where you could pretend privacy existed. Heavy fabric enclosed the sleeping space on all sides, blocking drafts, light, and the psychological awareness that 6 other people were breathing 8 feet away. These bed curtains weren't decoration. They were essential technology for maintaining social fiction. Behind those curtains, noble couples could consummate marriages, have private conversations, or simply change clothes without the entire household watching. The curtains created plausible deniability. Whatever happened behind them was theoretically private, even though everyone nearby could obviously hear everything. Medieval privacy was mostly acoustic theater, where everyone pretended not to notice sounds from enclosed beds. Peasant families couldn't afford frame beds with curtains, so they improvised. Hanging cloths or blankets from ceiling beams created makeshift partitions, dividing single rooms into semi-private zones. These curtains were rough linen or wool, often patched and stained, but they served the same psychological function as noble bed hangings. They created the illusion of privacy through visual obstruction, even though sound, smell, and common sense made actual privacy impossible. The curtain economy reflected broader social anxiety about privacy and observation. As cities grew and households became more crowded, the need for visual barriers increased. People who couldn't afford wooden walls or separate rooms invested whatever they could in fabric partitions. Market records show steady demand for cheap cloth suitable for household division, suggesting that even poor families prioritized privacy and appearance over other expenditures. The need to hide from neighbors while living among them became a universal medieval experience. Medieval advice literature occasionally addresses bedroom privacy, always euphemistically. One 15th century household manual suggests that married couples should maintain modesty even in private chambers, presumably meaning keep the bed curtains closed during marital intimacy. Another source warns against letting servants see the master's bed undressed, treating visible bedding as somehow shameful. The obsession with covering, concealing, and hiding basic domestic life reveals deep anxiety about who saw what and who knew what about your private behavior. But here's the genius of the curtain system as social control. Curtains created the possibility of privacy while simultaneously increasing surveillance anxiety. You could hide behind fabric, but doing so signaled you had something to hide. Drawing bed curtains during the day raised eyebrows. Too much privacy suggested concealment, probably something illicit or shameful. So people learned to calibrate their curtain use carefully, maintaining just enough privacy to avoid shame while avoiding so much privacy that you seemed suspicious. The wealthy developed elaborate curtain etiquette around guests and household members. When visitors arrived, bed curtains should be opened to demonstrate you weren't hiding anything inappropriate. When dressing or undressing, close curtains quickly and quietly. Never acknowledge hearing sounds from behind other people's curtains. Create this complex dance of seeing without looking, hearing without listening, knowing without acknowledging. Medieval social life was basically pretending everyone had privacy while ensuring nobody actually did. Nighttime bedroom behavior became particularly fraught because darkness plus curtains meant maximum privacy and therefore maximum suspicion. Parents monitored adolescent children's sleeping arrangements obsessively, ensuring proper separation and minimal privacy. Servants slept in positions where they could theoretically monitor their masters while maintaining the fiction of not watching. Everyone pretended the curtains created real privacy while simultaneously ensuring they didn't. The curtain system also regulated sexual behavior through architectural psychology. Bed curtains created the minimum privacy necessary for marital intimacy, while ensuring households never forgot that thin fabric was the only barrier between private acts and public knowledge. This kept sexual activity bounded by shame, modesty, and the constant awareness that your neighbors could absolutely tell what was happening. Medieval marriage was consummated in semi-privacy with perfect deniability and universal knowledge. Hygiene practices behind bedroom curtains followed similar logic. You could wash, change clothes, or use the chamber pot behind curtains, but everyone knew exactly what you were doing. The curtains provided visual modesty while ensuring behavioral transparency. You couldn't develop truly private hygiene habits because the curtain barrier was permeable to sound and smell. This meant bedroom hygiene became another performance regulated by invisible social rules about acceptable sounds, appropriate timing, and proper modesty. After curfew, when darkness and curtains theoretically provided privacy, medieval people faced the daily question of whether to wash before bed. Modern hygiene makes this automatic, but medieval logic made it complicated. Water had to be carried from wells or cisterns, often requiring multiple trips. Heating water meant fuel consumption, fire management, and significant effort. For most people, nighttime washing meant cold water, minimal light, and strategic decisions about which body parts actually required attention. The unwritten rules about nighttime washing reveal obsessive concern with maintaining proper standards despite impossible conditions. Clean hands and face were non-negotiable, accomplished with basin and cloth even in freezing weather. Clean feet were aspirational, dependent on weather, fuel, and energy. Clean bodies were rare, reserved for special occasions, or preceded by significant moral preparation. Medieval people didn't avoid washing because they were ignorant. They avoided it because the logistics made regular bathing nearly impossible. Religious authorities complicated matters by attaching moral weight to washing practices. Excessive attention to physical cleanliness suggested vanity and pride. Insufficient attention suggested sloth and disrespect for God's creation. Somehow, medieval people were supposed to navigate between too clean and too dirty, finding the spiritually acceptable middle ground of strategic hygiene. Naturally, this middle ground was never clearly defined, making everyone constantly anxious about whether their washing habits revealed moral defects. Women faced particularly intense scrutiny around nighttime washing because female cleanliness was somehow linked to virtue in ways male cleanliness wasn't. A woman who washed too carefully was vain. A woman who didn't wash carefully enough was slovenly. A woman who washed at the wrong times suggested moral laxity. Medieval gender dynamics meant women's hygiene became yet another arena for demonstrating respectability through invisible standards nobody could articulate but everyone supposedly recognized. The washing implements themselves became class markers. Wealthy households owned metal or ceramic wash basins, linen towels, and even scented soaps made from rendered fat and wood ash. Peasant families made do with wooden bowls, rough cloth, and plain water. The gap between washing infrastructure for rich and poor created visible hierarchy, even in the supposedly private domain of nighttime hygiene. Your washing tools announced your status as clearly as your clothing. Medieval medical theory added another layer of complication by claiming that washing at certain times was healthy, while washing at other times was dangerous. Night air was considered particularly hazardous, full of miasmas and pestilential vapors. Opening pores through washing supposedly made you vulnerable to these dangerous airs. Therefore, nighttime washing required careful timing. Too early and you'd be vulnerable during sleep. Too late and you'd disturb nocturnal humors. Medical advice literature provided elaborate, contradictory guidance that mostly succeeded in making everyone nervous about when they bathed. The truly brilliant control mechanism was making cleanliness a virtue that couldn't be performed publicly without seeming vain, but couldn't be proven privately without witnesses. You were supposed to wash carefully, but never discuss washing. Demonstrate cleanliness through results, but never mention the process. Show up clean without anyone knowing the effort behind it. This created perfect conditions for anxiety-driven self-policing, where everyone obsessed over hygiene standards nobody would acknowledge. Medieval people developed elaborate coded language for discussing washing without actually discussing it. Clean hands meant respectability. Fresh face suggested moral uprightness. Well-kempt hair implied proper household management. This euphemistic vocabulary let people signal their hygiene practices indirectly, maintaining the social fiction that bodily cleanliness wasn't worth explicit discussion, while simultaneously making it essential to reputation management. Children learned nighttime washing protocols through observation and occasional correction, absorbing unwritten rules about when, how, and how much to wash. These lessons weren't formal instruction, but cultural transmission through demonstration and shame. You learned by watching what produced praise versus disgust, what behaviors marked you as civilized versus animal, what habits signaled proper upbringing versus negligent parenting. Hygiene education was socialization through anxiety. The chamber pot wash reveals medieval hygiene logic perfectly. After nighttime chamber pot use, hand washing was theoretically mandatory, but practically optional, depending on circumstances. Rich households might keep a small washing bowl near the chamber pot specifically for this purpose. Poor families may do with whatever water remained from earlier. The social rule was clear: wash your hands after using the pot. But enforcement was entirely internal. Nobody checked. You just had to live with yourself and the possibility that others might somehow know. Medieval undergarments existed in a strange liminal space between visible and invisible, mandatory and shameful, protective and suspicious. The shift or chemise worn next to skin was theoretically universal but practically variable. Wealthy people changed linen regularly. Poor people owned maybe 2 shifts total, wearing one while washing the other, stretching the definition of clean as far as physics would allow. Your undergarment situation revealed class position more honestly than any external clothing ever could. The genius of medieval linen politics was making undergarment cleanliness a moral imperative while ensuring most people lacked the resources to maintain it. Clean linen was next to godliness, according to sermons and household manuals. Dirty linen suggested moral decay, probably sin. But linen was expensive, soap was scarce, and washing was labor-intensive. So medieval people were supposed to demonstrate virtue through clean undergarments they couldn't afford to maintain. Perfect recipe for universal shame and anxiety. Medieval people didn't change undergarments daily. They changed weekly if wealthy, monthly if middling, seasonally if poor. The shift worn against skin accumulated sweat, skin oils, and whatever else bodies produce, gradually transforming from white linen to gray, then brownish, then some color scientists probably haven't named yet. At some point, the shift became stiff enough to stand independently, signaling that washing could no longer be postponed. Laundry was a massive production, requiring significant resources and labor. Water had to be hauled, heated over fires, mixed with harsh soap made from wood ash and fat, then used to scrub linen by hand. Rinse multiple times. Wring until your hands cramped. Dry on bushes or indoor racks. The whole process consumed a full day minimum for even modest amounts of laundry. Most households washed linen monthly at best, creating obvious hygiene challenges that everyone pretended not to notice. Nighttime presented particular complications for undergarment management. Sleeping in your shift was normal and necessary, both for warmth and modesty. But this meant your undergarment accumulated an entire extra cycle of sweat and body oils nightly. Some wealthy people owned separate sleeping shifts, changed at bedtime like medieval pajamas. Everyone else wore the same shift day and night, washing whenever they could, hoping nobody noticed the gradually increasing smell. The shift created interesting tension between modesty and hygiene. Removing your shift exposed your body, violating countless taboos about nakedness, even in privacy. Keeping your shift on during washing meant incomplete hygiene, but maintained modesty. Most medieval people chose modesty over thoroughness, washing what they could reach while clothed and calling it sufficient. The shift became both protective barrier and concealment mechanism, more about hiding flesh than protecting it. Women's undergarments were particularly politicized because female linen somehow became linked to virtue in ways male linen never did. A woman with clean shifts was respectable, modest, worthy. A woman with dirty shifts was probably also dirty in other ways, morally suspect, dangerous. This gendered hygiene surveillance meant women bore disproportionate pressure to maintain undergarment cleanliness despite having identical resource constraints as men. Medieval misogyny extended all the way to dirty laundry. Medieval advice literature occasionally addresses proper undergarment care, always in euphemistic terms. One source suggests that godly women change their linen at least monthly, preferably more often, because cleanliness of person reflects purity of soul. Another warns against excessive linen changing as a sign of vanity and pride, because apparently even hygiene could be sinfully overdone. The impossible standards were the point. Make women anxious about their undergarments, and you've created perfect conditions for self-policing behavior. The really insidious mechanism was linking undergarment cleanliness to sexual purity. Clean linen somehow suggested sexual virtue. Soiled linen suggested moral contamination. This completely irrational connection between hygiene and chastity gave authorities yet another tool for monitoring female behavior. A woman's shift became evidence in reputation trials, proof of her moral character, testimony about her private habits that she could never fully control. Men faced less scrutiny, but still absorbed messages about linen and respectability. A gentleman changed his shirt regularly, demonstrating status and civilization. A working man wore his shirt until it disintegrated, because labor and cleanliness were supposedly incompatible. Class divisions were literally worn against the skin, visible through the quality and cleanliness of linen that nobody was supposed to see, but everyone somehow knew about. After curfew, undergarment decisions became daily negotiations between comfort, modesty, and hygiene. Change into a sleeping shift if you could afford one. Wash your day shift if you had energy and clean water, or just sleep in the same increasingly grimy garment you'd worn all week, trusting that darkness and curtains concealed the reality from your bedmates. Medieval nights were fragrant with denial and strategic ignorance about bodily cleanliness. Every medieval morning began with the same elaborate choreography. Before sunrise, before respectable people emerged, before social surveillance fully activated, someone from each household had to empty the chamber pot. This created an entire shadow economy of waste management that operated in the liminal space between night and day, private and public, acknowledged and denied. The night soil carriers, cesspit emptiers, and waste collectors formed an essential underclass whose labor made medieval cities habitable, while their presence made respectable people uncomfortable. The timing was everything. Empty your chamber pot too early, and you'd encounter other families doing the same thing, creating awkward moments where everyone pretended not to notice the buckets of human waste being carried through streets. Empty too late, and respectable neighbors would witness your shame, knowing exactly what that covered bucket contained. The unwritten rule was simple: finish waste disposal before 6 in the morning. Anyone still carrying chamber pots after sunrise marked themselves as slovenly, disorganized, probably morally deficient. Medieval cities developed elaborate informal systems for waste routing that everyone understood but nobody discussed. Certain alleys were designated through pure custom as appropriate dumping zones. Specific sections of city walls had waste chutes. Particular riverbanks received household refuse. None of this was officially sanctioned or legally regulated. It just emerged through collective practice, with violators punished not by law, but by neighborhood rage and social ostracism. The cesspit was the ultimate destination for most household waste, and its management reveals medieval society's genius for invisible infrastructure. Every neighborhood had shared cesspits, deep holes lined with stone or brick where waste accumulated until professional emptiers arrived for extraction. These pits had to be located close enough for convenient access, but far enough to avoid unbearable smell. The politics of cesspit placement created endless neighborhood conflicts that appear in contemporary records as property disputes, but were really fights about who had to smell whose shit. Professional cesspit emptiers, called gongfermors or night soil men, depending on region, operated exclusively after dark, earning the night part of their title through pure necessity. Nobody wanted to see this work happening. Nobody wanted to acknowledge it existed. So the gongfermors came after curfew, worked through the night, and disappeared before dawn, removing waste through a system so efficient it might as well have been magic for all the visibility it received. These men were paid surprisingly well for medieval standards, partly because the work was so awful that money was the only possible motivation. They descended into cesspits with buckets and ladles, manually scooping accumulated waste into larger containers, working in near total darkness because torches plus methane gas equaled exciting explosions. Some died from toxic fumes. Others fell into pits and drowned in waste. Most just accumulated diseases and died young. Medieval sanitation was literally built on bodies of workers nobody acknowledged. The really brilliant social control mechanism was making waste disposal so shameful that everyone collaborated in collective denial. You needed cesspits. Everyone needed cesspits. Cities would drown in waste without them. But admitting you contributed to cesspit filling was vulgar, crude, evidence of your animal nature. So people emptied their chamber pots, paid their waste fees, and pretended the entire system of collection and disposal was beneath their notice. Shame made people police themselves more effectively than any regulation. The morning disposal ritual created interesting class theater. Wealthy households had servants handle chamber pot emptying, allowing masters to maintain the fiction of never touching waste. The servant who emptied pots was among the lowest household positions, often young girls or elderly women who had no better options. Their labor made gentle hygiene possible, providing the manual work that let their employers claim civilized standards without acknowledging what civilization required. Poorer families had no servants to shield them from waste management reality. Parents emptied pots, children helped with carrying. Everyone participated in the daily humiliation of dealing with bodily waste in semi-public view. This became yet another class division, where the wealthy purchased privacy and the poor endured exposure, making hygiene hierarchy visible through who had to carry their own shit and who could pay others to pretend it didn't exist. Medieval cities occasionally tried to regulate waste disposal through ordinances forbidding throwing refuse into streets or dumping chamber pots from windows. These laws failed spectacularly because they targeted symptoms rather than causes. Without proper infrastructure for waste collection, people had limited disposal options. The laws just made everyone more furtive about disposal, ensuring it happened in darkness where authorities couldn't observe or punish. The night soil economy created strange paradoxes. Cities needed waste collectors to survive, but treated collectors as untouchable. Households relied on cesspits, but found cesspit maintenance disgusting. Everyone participated in waste generation, but claimed cleanliness as personal virtue. Medieval sanitation existed in permanent contradiction, essential yet shameful, universal yet unmentionable, the foundation of urban life and the source of urban disgust. The dawn disposal ritual was just the beginning, because medieval hygiene anxiety extended far beyond waste management into every aspect of private behavior. And nowhere was this more evident than in the bedroom practices that supposedly nobody witnessed, but everyone knew about. If this exploration of medieval chamber pots and cesspit politics is giving you that satisfying feeling of understanding hidden systems, that's exactly what Candle History is about. The subscribe button is there if you want more. Medieval beds were social spaces, not private ones. Traveling merchants shared inn beds with strangers. Servants slept with other servants in household beds. Children slept 3 or 4 to a bed until marriage. Even married couples often shared beds with infants, elderly relatives, or visiting family. The idea of one person per bed was wealthy eccentricity, foreign to most medieval experience. This made sleep hygiene particularly fraught because your hygiene choices affected everyone sharing your mattress. The protocols around bed sharing were elaborate and entirely unwritten. You learned through doing, making mistakes, and receiving correction ranging from gentle hints to violence, depending on the violation severity. Basic rules included sleep clothed, in shifts, don't steal blankets, don't thrash or kick, control your bodily functions as much as humanly possible. Breaking these rules made you unbearable to sleep with, which in crowded households meant social catastrophe. Medieval people understood that sleeping in close quarters required behavioral modification. They developed the concept of sleeping courtesy, which was basically how not to make bedmates homicidal through the night. Keep your feet to yourself. Don't snore excessively. Control gas emissions. Wake others gently if necessary. These weren't laws or even explicit rules. They were survival strategies for communal sleeping that everyone absorbed through bitter experience. Personal hygiene before bed became partly about self-comfort and partly about maintaining acceptable bedfellow status. If you climbed into a shared bed filthy and reeking, your bedmates would remember. Next time sleeping arrangements were negotiated, you'd find yourself relegated to the floor or stuck with the most undesirable sleeping companions. Social pressure to maintain minimum hygiene standards before bed was intense because the consequences were immediate and uncomfortable. Women bore disproportionate responsibility for bed hygiene because they were somehow supposed to maintain cleanliness despite identical constraints as men. Medieval gender logic decided that women were naturally cleaner, more modest, more capable of managing household hygiene. This translated into women doing more washing, changing linens more frequently, and bearing blame when bed hygiene standards slipped. Medieval misogyny meant women worked harder to maintain standards they didn't create. Bedding maintenance was constant labor that mostly fell on women. Straw mattresses required regular replacement as straw decomposed and accumulated pests. Linen sheets needed frequent washing, though frequent meant monthly at best for most households. Wool blankets were nearly impossible to clean thoroughly, so they accumulated smells and stains until they became more texture than fabric. Maintaining even minimum bed hygiene required resources most families struggled to access. Bed bugs were the universal equalizer, infesting wealthy and poor beds with democratic enthusiasm. No amount of washing or wealth prevented infestation. Medieval people tried herbs, oils, and prayers, all equally ineffective against parasites that had evolved specifically to exploit human sleeping habits. The best strategy was regular mattress replacement and hoping your new straw didn't already contain bug populations. Bed bugs made medieval sleep a constant negotiation between exhaustion and itching. The protocols around nighttime bodily functions in shared beds created elaborate social theater. Everyone knew that occasionally people needed to urinate during the night. Chamber pots were positioned near beds specifically for this purpose. But acknowledging nighttime chamber pot use violated unwritten rules about pretending bodily functions didn't exist.
So people developed stealth techniques for using pots while causing minimum disturbance, hoping bedmates would sleep through or politely ignore the obvious sounds. Children learned sleep hygiene through correction and occasional punishment. Bedwetting was common and harshly disciplined, partly because wet mattresses were so difficult to dry and clean. Children who couldn't control nighttime functions were shamed, sometimes beaten, occasionally forced to sleep on floors instead of beds. The cruelty was partly frustration with resource scarcity and partly social training, teaching children that private behavior had public consequences. Medieval medical theory complicated sleep hygiene by claiming that nighttime air was dangerous and that sleeping with open windows invited disease. So, most people slept in sealed rooms with minimal ventilation, sharing air with multiple others, accumulating carbon dioxide and body heat. The sealed sleeping environment intensified hygiene challenges because there was nowhere for smells, moisture, or heat to escape. Medieval bedrooms were basically low-stakes sensory deprivation chambers. The wealthiest could afford bed curtains that created semi-private sleeping zones even in shared rooms. But curtains weren't soundproof. Everyone heard everything. The fiction was that curtains created privacy. The reality was that curtains just made everyone pretend not to hear what they obviously heard. Medieval sleep happened in this weird space of acoustic transparency with visual concealment, creating the illusion of privacy through architectural theater. Dawn brought the transformation from private person to public performer. Medieval mornings required careful preparation because your appearance announced your moral character, social status, and household management to everyone who saw you. You couldn't stumble into public looking like you'd spent the night doing what everyone actually spent nights doing, which was sleeping in questionable hygiene surrounded by other people's questionable hygiene. The morning washing ritual was partly hygiene and partly costume change, preparing your public face to conceal your private reality. Wealthy people had servants help with this transformation, providing warm water, clean cloths, and assistance with hair and clothing. Poor people made do with cold water and whatever energy they could muster after a night of uncomfortable sleep and crowded conditions. The gap between rich and poor morning preparation created visible hierarchy that everyone recognized and nobody discussed. Face washing was absolutely mandatory, the bare minimum of presenting yourself as civilized. Even the poorest peasants splashed cold water on their face before emerging publicly. Clean face signaled that you cared about appearance, respected social norms, acknowledged the difference between private and public self. Dirty face suggested dissolution, moral decay, someone who'd given up on maintaining standards. Medieval face washing was less about hygiene and more about signaling participation in social order. Hair management was particularly important because visible hair announced your status and character. Unmarried women wore hair uncovered and elaborately arranged. Married women covered hair with veils or caps. Men kept hair and beards trimmed according to profession and class. Everyone understood that hair was messaging, communicating identity through maintenance and style. Morning hair preparation was essential performance, telling the world who you were and what group you belonged to. Medieval people developed elaborate cosmetic practices to conceal hygiene realities. Wealthy women used powders to disguise skin blemishes created by rarely bathing and poor nutrition. Men used oils to make hair appear cleaner than actual washing would achieve. These cosmetics weren't vanity, but necessity, tools for maintaining public appearance despite private hygiene constraints. You couldn't actually be clean most of the time, so you learned to appear clean through strategic fakery. The clothing change was crucial theater. You slept in your shift, but emerged in clean outer garments. The contrast created the illusion that somehow you'd maintained perfect hygiene overnight. Nobody was fooled, but everyone participated in the fiction. Acknowledge someone's morning transformation from night person to day person, and you'd violated essential social rules about preserving dignity through collective denial. Morning breath presented interesting challenges. Medieval dental hygiene was minimal. People chewed herbs or used rough cloths to scrub teeth, but actual tooth cleaning was rare and ineffective. The result was universal morning breath that everyone had and nobody mentioned. Social rules required maintaining conversation distance that accommodated breath reality while pretending breath quality was imperceptible. Medieval social spacing was basically breath management through polite ignorance. The performance of morning readiness required concealing evidence of nighttime reality. Chamber pots had to be emptied and hidden before anyone respectable saw them. Bedroom curtains were opened to demonstrate you weren't concealing anything shameful. Bed linens were arranged to hide stains or wear. The entire process was stagecraft, transforming private space into something publicly presentable through careful concealment and strategic display. Women particularly bore pressure to demonstrate proper morning preparation because female appearance was heavily policed. A woman who emerged with disheveled hair, dirty face, or inappropriate clothing faced immediate judgment. Medieval gender norms meant women's appearance was both their responsibility and their liability, something they controlled but were judged for, requiring constant vigilant maintenance despite impossible standards. The morning transformation reveals how medieval social control operated through internalized surveillance. Nobody checked whether you'd washed properly or changed clothes or prepared yourself correctly, but you knew that everyone who saw you would draw conclusions, make judgments, form opinions based on your appearance. So you performed morning hygiene partly for comfort and partly for reputation, policing yourself more effectively than any external authority ever could. Medieval neighborhoods were surveillance states, powered by curiosity and enforced through gossip. Everyone watched everyone else, noting who emptied chamber pots when, whose laundry hung on which days, which households maintained what standards. This information circulated through conversation, transformed into judgment, and returned as reputation. Your hygiene practices were never truly private because neighbors made knowing them their business. The gossip economy functioned as distributed surveillance, more effective than any formal policing. Women gathering at wells to draw water exchanged information about household hygiene. Servants reported their master's habits to other servants, creating an underground intelligence network about wealthy people's private practices. Market conversations covered who washed regularly versus who let standards slip. Information flowed constantly, building comprehensive knowledge about everyone's hygiene behavior. This surveillance wasn't malicious, necessarily. It was social maintenance, the mechanism through which communities enforced standards without formal rules. If everyone knew that certain families maintained excellent hygiene while others let things slide, social pressure could encourage conformity without requiring laws or punishments. Reputation management through gossip was remarkably effective at encouraging behavioral modification. Medieval people understood that gossip could destroy reputation more thoroughly than any legal proceeding. Being labeled unclean was social death, marking you as someone respectable people avoided. Once gossip established your poor hygiene, escaping that reputation became nearly impossible. So people worked obsessively to prevent gossip through careful public behavior, knowing that one visible hygiene failure could follow them for years. Women were particularly vulnerable to hygiene gossip because female cleanliness was moralized in ways male cleanliness wasn't. A woman with dirty children faced judgment about her mothering. A woman with grimy house faced judgment about her character. A woman whose laundry appeared infrequently faced judgment about her household management.
Medieval gender norms made women responsible for hygiene outcomes while denying them resources to achieve expected standards, creating perfect conditions for constant criticism. The gossip network transmitted hygiene knowledge across generations. Mothers taught daughters not just through direct instruction, but through commentary about neighbors. Who maintained proper standards? Who let things slide? What behaviors marked you as respectable versus slovenly? This social knowledge was cultural inheritance, passing norms and judgments from generation to generation without ever codifying them in writing. Medieval people developed elaborate strategies for managing gossip risk. Visible public hygiene displays signaled respectability. Ostentatious laundry hanging demonstrated washing frequency. Clean children paraded through streets announced proper parenting. These performances weren't about actual hygiene, but about being seen to care about hygiene, which mattered more for reputation than hygiene reality. The really insidious mechanism was how gossip created competition around hygiene standards. If your neighbor washed weekly, you needed to wash weekly to avoid negative comparison. If someone's children appeared cleaner than yours, you needed to improve visible child hygiene. The gossip economy ratcheted standards higher through competitive comparison, making everyone work harder to maintain respectability relative to neighbors. Medieval gossip also punished hygiene overachievement. Someone who washed too frequently became suspect, probably vain, possibly covering something shameful. Excessive cleanliness suggested moral weakness, caring too much about appearance, aspiring above your station. The gossip economy enforced both minimum and maximum standards, creating a narrow acceptable range where proper people maintained hygiene without seeming obsessed. Servants occupied a particularly interesting position in the gossip economy because they witnessed private hygiene behavior but couldn't openly discuss it without violating employment obligations. This created a shadow information market where servants traded knowledge discreetly, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that wealthy people's private habits eventually became semi-public knowledge. No amount of money purchased complete privacy from servant observation and discussion. The gossip surveillance system was essentially crowdsourced social control. Nobody had formal authority to enforce hygiene standards, but everyone had social power to judge, comment, and shape reputation. This distributed enforcement was more powerful than top-down legislation because it was constant, everywhere, impossible to escape. You couldn't hide from gossip because gossip lived in every conversation. The church had opinions about medieval hygiene, and those opinions were confusing, contradictory, and somehow simultaneously demanding and dismissive. On one hand, cleanliness was next to godliness. On the other hand, excessive attention to physical cleanliness suggested sinful vanity. Medieval people were supposed to navigate between these poles, maintaining proper hygiene without caring too much about hygiene, achieving spiritual cleanliness through methods that might or might not involve actual washing. Religious teachings about the body created fundamental anxiety because flesh was simultaneously God's creation and the source of temptation. You were supposed to respect your body as divine gift while subduing it as source of sin. How much hygiene honored God versus indulging flesh was never clearly defined, leaving everyone to guess whether their washing habits demonstrated piety or pride. Monastic communities developed elaborate hygiene rules that reveal church ambivalence about cleanliness. Monks were required to wash hands before prayers and meals, demonstrating that physical cleanliness prepared you for spiritual activity. But excessive bathing was often prohibited as form of mortification, proving that suffering the discomfort of dirt brought you closer to God. The rules simultaneously demanded and banned washing, creating cognitive dissonance that monks apparently just lived with. The church particularly obsessed over washing practices around religious ceremonies. Before Mass, clean hands. Before communion, clean soul. But the relationship between physical and spiritual cleanliness remained mystical and vague. Sometimes, physical washing prepared you for spiritual reception. Sometimes, physical washing was irrelevant to spiritual state. The ambiguity meant everyone worried constantly about whether they'd washed correctly for religious purposes.
Medieval Christianity inherited Jewish ritual purity concepts, but stripped away the specific rules, leaving anxiety without guidance. Jewish law provided detailed washing requirements for various circumstances. Christianity said worry about spiritual purity more than physical washing, which sounded profound, but provided zero practical guidance about when actual washing mattered. The result was neurotic uncertainty about whether God cared if you washed. Saints and ascetics who rejected bathing became models of holy discomfort, proving spiritual advancement through strategic filth. Stories circulated about holy people who never bathed, wore the same clothes for years, and achieved sanctity through embodying disgust. These examples suggested that maybe dirtiness was actually holiness, that suffering physical discomfort proved devotion, that rejecting hygiene brought you closer to God. But simultaneously, church authorities insisted that appearing before God in church required clean hands and face, proper clothing, and respectable presentation. So you were supposed to both embrace holy filth and maintain proper cleanliness, achieving both simultaneously through mental gymnastics. Medieval religious hygiene was basically impossible standards applied inconsistently. The church particularly weaponized hygiene anxiety around women. Female cleanliness was linked to sexual purity in ways male cleanliness never was. A woman who bathed frequently was probably vain and possibly unchaste. A woman who didn't bathe was probably slovenly and possibly immoral. The impossible standard was the point, ensuring women could never satisfy religious expectations about appropriate hygiene. Confession added another layer of hygiene anxiety because you were supposed to confess sins of excess. Was washing too much a sin? Was not washing enough a sin? How much hygiene was vanity versus how much was proper self-care? People actually confessed hygiene practices to priests, seeking absolution for washing decisions, turning basic cleanliness into theological crisis. Religious holidays created temporary hygiene rules that everyone understood but nobody codified. Before Easter, wash yourself as preparation for Christ's resurrection. Before Christmas, clean your home as Mary cleaned her dwelling. These seasonal washing requirements were partly hygiene and partly religious theater, proving devotion through specific cleaning practices that became ritualized over time. The genius of religious hygiene anxiety was making people internalize contradictory standards that ensured constant self-doubt. You could never be certain your hygiene practices satisfied both physical and spiritual requirements. This uncertainty made people hyper-aware of hygiene decisions, constantly evaluating whether washing choices demonstrated proper priorities or revealed moral failings. Religion turned hygiene into perpetual ethical calculation. Medieval people developed strategies for satisfying religious hygiene expectations through minimum visible effort. Wash hands before church. Clean face before confession. Maintain outer appearance of cleanliness, while inner hygiene remained optional. The performance mattered more than the reality, demonstrating that you understood proper behavior even if you didn't always practice it privately. Medieval medical theory approached hygiene with impressive confidence, given that they were completely wrong about everything. The dominant framework was humoral theory, which explained health through balances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Washing supposedly affected these humors in complex ways that nobody could actually observe or measure, but everyone claimed to understand. Medieval medicine was basically confident nonsense applied to bodily maintenance. According to medical authorities, washing opened the pores, making you vulnerable to dangerous airs and corrupting influences. This meant bathing required careful timing and preparation. Wash at the wrong phase of the moon, and you'd invite disease. Wash too frequently, and you'd weaken your natural protective layer. Wash after eating, and you'd disrupt digestion. Medieval medical advice about washing was an elaborate system of restrictions based on zero actual knowledge. The miasma theory of disease created particular hygiene paranoia. Bad air caused illness, according to medieval medicine, so you wanted to avoid anything that opens your pores to atmospheric corruption. Since washing supposedly enlarged pores, bathing could actually increase disease risk in theory. This meant medical authorities often recommended against washing, creating perfect justification for avoiding the massive effort of heating water and hauling tubs. Medieval physicians developed elaborate washing protocols for the brave or wealthy who attempted bathing. First, prepare the air with aromatic smoke to purify the bathing environment. Heat water to exact temperatures depending on your humoral balance. Add herbs based on your constitution. Enter slowly to avoid shocking the system. Wash quickly to minimize pore opening. Exit immediately and cover yourself to prevent dangerous air entry. The protocols made bathing so complicated that avoiding it seemed reasonable. Different body parts supposedly required different washing frequencies according to medical logic. Hands and face could handle daily washing because they were less vulnerable to humoral disruption. Feet required careful attention because they connected you to earth and its corrupting influences. The torso was particularly delicate, requiring minimal washing to avoid disturbing vital organs. Medieval anatomy was impressively wrong but confidently specific. Medical texts addressed nighttime washing with particular concern because sleep supposedly made you especially vulnerable to atmospheric influences. Washing before bed opened pores that remained vulnerable during unconsciousness. But not washing allowed accumulated corruption to settle into flesh during sleep. The medical advice was basically impossible to follow, ensuring everyone worried they were damaging their health through incorrect washing choices. The wealthy could afford physicians who provided personalized hygiene advice based on individual humoral balance. The poor got whatever folk wisdom circulated through communities, creating yet another class division in hygiene practices. Rich people had professional guidance about their washing. Poor people just guessed and hoped. Medical authority was another luxury good, purchased through consultation fees. Dental hygiene received particularly confused medical attention. Teeth were bones, according to medieval anatomy, and therefore dead tissue that didn't require maintenance. Except teeth obviously rotted and caused pain, so maybe they weren't dead. Maybe washing them helped. Maybe washing them harmed the natural protective layer. Medical authorities couldn't decide, so people did whatever seemed to work or nothing at all. Medieval medicine particularly obsessed over washing during illness. Fever meant your humors were disrupted, so washing might restore balance. Or washing might worsen the disruption. Plague doctors recommended washing visible body parts, but avoiding internal cleansing that might spread corruption deeper. The advice was contradictory and useless, but delivered with absolute confidence that made people follow it anyway. The pseudoscientific theories about washing created perfect conditions for anxiety and self-policing. You couldn't know whether your washing practices were helping or harming because medical theory provided no consistent guidance.
So you worried constantly, second-guessed hygiene decisions, sought advice from authorities who confidently provided wrong information. Medieval medical hygiene was anxiety amplifier disguised as scientific knowledge. The really brilliant control mechanism was how medical theory moralized hygiene through supposedly neutral science. Your humoral balance reflected your moral character. Disease came from corrupted humors and corrupted behavior. Therefore, your washing practices revealed both physical and moral health. Medical hygiene became yet another tool for judging character through bodily maintenance, wrapped in scientific language that made judgment seem objective. Hygiene was class warfare by other means. The wealthy could afford servants, hot water, soap, clean linen, and all the infrastructure that made regular washing possible. The poor could afford buckets, cold water, and hope. This material reality created visible hierarchy where cleanliness marked social position more honestly than clothing or titles. You couldn't fake prolonged hygiene because it required resources only wealth could sustain. Wealthy households employed entire staffs dedicated to hygiene maintenance. Laundresses washed linens weekly. Chambermaids managed chamber pots and sleeping arrangements. Personal servants helped with bathing and dressing. The labor required for upper-class hygiene was massive, hidden behind closed doors, performed by invisible workers who enabled their masters to claim natural superiority through paid cleanliness. The really insidious mechanism was how wealth permitted hygiene while poverty prevented it. Then society moralized the resulting difference as proof of character. Rich people were clean because they were disciplined and virtuous. Poor people were dirty because they were lazy and immoral. The fact that wealth purchased hygiene while poverty prevented it disappeared from moral evaluation, leaving just the judgment that cleanliness revealed inner worth. Medieval cities developed visual hygiene hierarchies where you could determine someone's status at a glance through cleanliness markers. Clean face and hands? Probably middling class with some hygiene capacity. Dirty hands but clean face? Working class attempting respectability. Completely filthy? Destitute or deliberately degraded. These visual codes let people sort each other instantly, making hygiene surveillance automatic and constant. The wealthy developed elaborate hygiene performances specifically designed to demonstrate their superior status. Frequent clothing changes, visible linen quality, obvious bathing preparations that servants handled in semi-public view. These performances weren't about actual hygiene, but about showing that you could afford hygiene infrastructure. The display mattered more than the cleanliness, proving status through visible resource consumption. Poor families developed strategies for appearing cleaner than resources allowed, focusing effort on visible hygiene markers that created respectability illusions. Clean face, even with dirty clothes. Washed hands, even with unwashed bodies. Presentable children, even with chaotic households. These strategic performances tried to claim respectability despite poverty, though everyone understood the performance was effort, not reality. The church complicated class hygiene by preaching that all souls were equal while obviously privileging wealthy cleanliness. Sermons condemned vanity while accepting that wealthy people maintained better hygiene. Religious authorities insisted that spiritual cleanliness mattered more than physical washing, while clearly respecting clean supplicants more than dirty ones. The gap between religious theory and social practice was massive and universally ignored. Medieval sumptuary laws regulated clothing but not hygiene, creating interesting gaps in social control. You couldn't wear certain fabrics above your station, but theoretically, anyone could be clean. In practice, only wealth permitted sustained cleanliness, making hygiene a class marker that didn't require legal enforcement. Social reality regulated hygiene more effectively than legislation ever could. The hygiene gap between rich and poor appeared most starkly in sleeping arrangements. Wealthy beds with clean linen, regular washing, separate chambers. Poor beds with dirty straw, minimal washing, shared spaces. The sleeping environment revealed class position through hygiene infrastructure that shaped health outcomes, disease risk, and life expectancy. Hygiene wasn't cosmetic, it was literally life and death, distributed by wealth. Servants occupied a weird position in the hygiene hierarchy because they maintained wealthy people's cleanliness while living in conditions that prevented their own. Laundresses washed their masters' linens in cold water while wearing dirty clothes. Chambermaids emptied wealthy chamber pots while using communal facilities. The labor hierarchy meant servants created hygiene they couldn't access, maintaining class divisions through their own degradation. The genius of hygiene as class control was making it seem natural and inevitable. Wealth permitted cleanliness. Poverty prevented it. The resulting difference appeared to reflect character rather than resources. Medieval society transformed economic inequality into moral hierarchy through hygiene, using bodily cleanliness to justify social divisions as proof of inherent worthiness rather than access to water and soap. But class divisions and religious anxiety were just surface control. The real genius of medieval hygiene regulation was what it did to children, transforming behavioral training into cultural inheritance that lasted centuries. Medieval childhood was abbreviated, brutal, and heavily focused on behavioral training that would last a lifetime. Hygiene education was cultural transmission disguised as practical instruction, teaching not just how to wash, but why certain bodies required washing while others didn't, why some hygiene practices demonstrated respectability while others revealed degradation, why following invisible rules mattered more than following visible laws. Children learned hygiene through observation, correction, and occasional violence. Watch how mother empties the chamber pot. Note when father washes hands. Observe what behaviors produce praise versus disgust. Medieval pedagogy was mostly demonstration, plus punishment, teaching through pattern recognition rather than explanation. You learned hygiene rules by experiencing consequences, a violation, not through understanding principles. The correction cycle was simple and effective. Violate hygiene norms, experience disgust reactions from adults, feel shame, modify behavior to avoid future shame. This process repeated until children internalized reactions so completely that external correction became unnecessary. By adolescence, most children had absorbed enough hygiene anxiety to self-police effectively, continuing patterns without understanding why they mattered. Gendered hygiene training began early, teaching boys and girls different standards, priorities, and responsibilities. Girls learned that their cleanliness mattered more, that they'd be judged more harshly, that hygiene was somehow linked to virtue in ways boys didn't experience. Boys learned that washing was optional but useful, that cleanliness was convenient but not moral necessity. Medieval gender socialization used hygiene as training ground for broader inequality. The invisible rules children learned were more powerful than explicit instruction because they became intuitive knowledge rather than conscious practice. You didn't think about whether to wash hands after using chamber pot, you just felt wrong not washing, felt disgust at the imagined contamination, felt compelled to cleanse. This transformed social rules into bodily reactions, making compliance automatic and resistance uncomfortable. Children particularly absorbed shame-based hygiene training around bodily functions. Urination and defecation were shameful, requiring privacy and concealment, even from family. Children learned to hide natural functions, feel disgust at their own bodies, view elimination as something dirty and wrong. This shame programming lasted lifetimes, shaping adult relationships with their own physicality in ways they never examined or questioned. Medieval pedagogy used other children as enforcement mechanism. Siblings monitored each other's hygiene, reporting violations to parents. Playmates ostracized children with poor hygiene, creating peer pressure toward conformity. The social pain of hygiene failure among other children taught lessons more effectively than any adult punishment, making conformity essential for basic social acceptance. The hygiene training children received varied dramatically by class, perpetuating social hierarchy through embodied habits. Wealthy children learned elaborate washing protocols, proper linen management, and sophisticated hygiene performances. Poor children learned survival basics, minimum standards for avoiding disease, and strategic hygiene displays for claiming respectability. These different trainings produced adults with different hygiene capacities that seemed natural rather than constructed. Children's hygiene education included moral components that linked cleanliness to virtue. Clean children were good children. Dirty children were probably also bad in other ways. The equation was simple, ridiculous, and powerfully effective at motivating compliance. Children learned that their bodies were evidence of their character, that cleanliness revealed inner goodness, that hygiene was moral performance rather than practical necessity. The transmission of hygiene anxiety from parents to children created intergenerational patterns of shame and surveillance. Parents who'd learned to fear hygiene judgment passed those fears to children. Children who grew up anxious about cleanliness became parents who taught anxiety to their children. The cycle perpetuated itself across generations, creating cultural patterns that lasted centuries without anyone questioning their origins. Medieval childhood hygiene training was essentially behavioral programming that installed invisible control mechanisms. By the time children reached adulthood, they'd internalized so many hygiene rules that external enforcement became unnecessary. They policed themselves more effectively than any authority could, continuing patterns because violation felt wrong, rather than because rule. The genius was making hygiene training feel like care rather than control. Parents taught children to wash, not to install surveillance mechanisms, but to protect them from disease and social judgment. The loving intention masked the control function, making children grateful for training that restricted their autonomy and installed anxiety about basic bodily functions. Medieval hygiene education was sophisticated oppression wrapped in parental concern. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We're still doing it. The medieval hygiene anxiety program is running in your brain right now, making you shower daily not because you're actually dirty, but because not showering feels wrong. Making you wash hands compulsively, not because contamination is real, but because the imagined disgust is unbearable. Making you judge people by their cleanliness, not because hygiene reflects character, but because medieval social control mechanisms installed that equation so deep we can't see it anymore. Modern bathrooms are privacy theater, inherited directly from medieval chamber pot shame. We build entire rooms dedicated to bodily functions we're taught never to discuss. Install locks to ensure complete privacy for acts that every human performs. Create architectural barriers between elimination and social space, because medieval shame programming convinced us that bodily waste must be hidden, concealed, never acknowledged. Your bathroom isn't about hygiene. It's about maintaining medieval fiction that proper people don't eliminate waste. The modern hygiene industry is a multi-billion-dollar descendant of medieval anxiety about cleanliness and character. We buy endless products promising to eliminate odors, remove bacteria, ensure freshness, all marketed through fear that natural human smell is disgusting and unacceptable. Medieval people used herbs in chamber pots. We use chemical fragrances in toilets. Different technology, identical anxiety about bodily reality being shameful and requiring concealment. The class dynamics persist too.
Wealthy people maintain elaborate hygiene infrastructure through cleaning services, premium products, and private facilities. Poor people make do with public restrooms, cheap soap, and inadequate plumbing. Then society judges hygiene outcomes as proof of character while ignoring resource inequality. Medieval logic that cleanliness reveals virtue rather than wealth is alive and functioning in every conversation about personal responsibility and hygiene standards. We've medicalized medieval hygiene anxiety, wrapping old shame in scientific language that makes it seem rational. Bacteria aren't demons, but they're described similarly: invisible contaminants requiring constant vigilance and removal. Hand sanitizer isn't holy water, but it serves similar psychological function: ritual purification that makes us feel safe from invisible threats. Modern hygiene is medieval anxiety with better microbiology. The surveillance mechanisms have evolved, but the core logic remains identical. Medieval neighbors gossiped about hygiene. Modern social media judges people through photographs, videos, and commentary about their cleanliness. The distribution technology improved, but the social function stayed constant. Use hygiene as proxy for character judgment. Create anxiety about being observed as unclean. Enforce behavioral conformity through shame rather than law. Gender dynamics are particularly persistent inheritance from medieval hygiene control. Women still face harsher judgment about cleanliness than men. Women's bathrooms have more stalls because somehow female elimination requires more privacy than male. Women's hygiene is still moralized and linked to sexuality in ways men's isn't. Medieval double standards about hygiene survive centuries of social change because they're installed so deep that recognizing them feels impossible. We've inherited medieval confusion about when hygiene matters versus when it's excessive. Shower too rarely and you're disgusting. Shower too frequently and you're vain or anxious. The sweet spot is never defined, ensuring everyone worries constantly about whether their hygiene practices are appropriate. Medieval anxiety about proper cleanliness levels is now backed by conflicting medical advice about skin biomes and beneficial bacteria. The really brilliant medieval inheritance is how completely hygiene anxiety disappears from conscious awareness. You don't think about why you wash hands after bathroom use, you just do it automatically because not doing it feels wrong. Medieval behavioral programming achieved perfection. Rules that enforce themselves invisibly, making compliance feel natural rather than constructed. Impossible to resist because resistance triggers disgust reactions installed in childhood. Modern privacy norms around hygiene are direct medieval inheritance. We build walls around toilets not because elimination requires concealment, but because we've internalized shame about bodily functions. We speak in euphemisms about bathroom activities, not because clarity is impossible, but because medieval linguistic evasion became cultural standard. We maintain elaborate fictions about hygiene being private matter, despite it being universal human experience. The pandemic revealed how fragile modern hygiene logic actually is. Suddenly, hand washing became obsessive rather than sufficient. Public spaces required constant sanitization. Touching surfaces felt dangerous. Medieval anxiety about contamination and invisible threats surged immediately, revealing that underneath modern rationality lives pure medieval panic about contagion, dirt, and bodily vulnerability. Science provided better language, but anxiety levels remained medieval. We judge homeless people through medieval hygiene lens, seeing their visible dirt as proof of moral failure, rather than evidence of lacking access to hygiene infrastructure. Medieval logic that cleanliness reveals character appears in every conversation about personal responsibility and poverty. The wealthy maintain pristine hygiene through resources. The poor struggle with limited access. Society blames poor people for hygiene failures while ignoring resource inequality. Pure medieval class dynamics.
The modern bathroom industry sells medieval privacy in architectural form. Separate rooms for elimination, multiple bathrooms in single homes, master bathrooms creating hygiene hierarchy within households. All of this is medieval chamber pot shame translated into contemporary construction, building physical barriers around activities medieval people taught us to hide, conceal, and feel ashamed about. Children today learn hygiene through identical mechanisms medieval children experienced. Potty training creates shame around elimination. Hand washing becomes moral imperative linked to being good. Cleanliness gets praised as virtue. Dirtiness gets punished as character flaw. Modern parenting reproduces medieval behavioral programming because we inherited training methods, along with anxiety, passing both to next generation without examining either. Here's the thing about medieval hygiene control. It worked perfectly. The system they designed to regulate behavior through shame, gossip, and internalized surveillance didn't just survive, it thrived. It adapted to new technology, new medical understanding, new social structures, while maintaining core function of using bodily cleanliness as character judgment and social control. We're living in the medieval hygiene surveillance state. We just don't notice because we're too busy washing our hands. Thank you for spending over 2 hours exploring medieval chamber pots, hygiene anxiety, and the invisible rules that still govern our relationship with our own bodies. If you found value in understanding how medieval social control built the bathroom habits you perform automatically every day, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Candle History and share your thoughts. What surprised you most about the medieval origins of modern hygiene? What made you uncomfortable about recognizing medieval control mechanisms in your own behavior? I read every comment and genuinely want to know what resonated. We began with a chamber pot in a medieval bedroom, an object so mundane that nobody thought to document the elaborate rituals surrounding it. Now, hours later, you understand that the chamber pot was never just a bucket. It was the centerpiece of humanity's most successful behavioral control system, one that operated without laws, without enforcement, without even conscious acknowledgement. Medieval people engineered social pressure so perfectly that it installed itself in human consciousness and ran automatically for centuries. The curfew bell that started this journey didn't create privacy. It created anxiety about privacy, forcing people to perform hygiene in semi-public spaces while pretending privacy existed, developing elaborate denial mechanisms around basic bodily functions, learning to police themselves more effectively than any guard ever could. The genius wasn't the bell. It was what the bell made people do in darkness, how it transformed private behavior into public performance, even when nobody was watching. Medieval hygiene regulation reveals something profound about human social control. The most effective rules are never written down. They're transmitted through shame, enforced through gossip, and internalized so completely that violation becomes psychologically unbearable rather than legally risky. Medieval people understood that you don't need laws about chamber pot etiquette if everyone's already anxious enough about hygiene judgment to monitor themselves constantly. The parallels to modern surveillance are obvious and uncomfortable. We think we're free because nobody watches a shower. But medieval control didn't require watchers. It required making people install the watcher inside their own heads, creating disgust reactions and shame responses that made compliance automatic. Your bathroom behavior isn't private choice. It's medieval programming, executing flawlessly after centuries. The class dynamics are particularly persistent and pernicious. Medieval society used hygiene to justify inequality, claiming that wealthy cleanliness proved superior character rather than superior resources. We're still doing it, still judging people by hygiene outcomes while ignoring infrastructure inequality, still assuming cleanliness reveals virtue rather than wealth. Medieval class warfare through hygiene never ended. It just got better marketing. The gender dynamics reveal how thoroughly medieval social control embedded itself in culture. Women's hygiene is still moralized, still linked to sexuality, still judged more harshly than men's. Medieval double standards about female cleanliness survived women's suffrage, workplace equality, and sexual revolution because they operate below conscious thought, installed through childhood training that feels like care rather than control. The religious anxiety around hygiene has secularized, but not disappeared. We don't worry about humoral balance anymore. We worry about skin microbiomes. We don't fear demonic possession through open pores. We fear bacterial contamination through inadequate washing. Different vocabulary, identical anxiety about invisible threats requiring constant vigilance and ritual purification. Medieval hygiene panic just learned to speak scientific. The childhood transmission mechanism ensures these patterns continue. Parents who internalized medieval hygiene anxiety teach it to children who internalize it and teach their children. The chain never breaks because intervention would require recognizing that hygiene training is behavioral control rather than health education. Most parents genuinely believe they're protecting children when they install medieval surveillance programs in developing minds. What makes medieval hygiene control so brilliant is how completely it's disappeared from view. You don't think about why you wash hands after using the toilet. You don't question why bathrooms require privacy. You don't examine why cleanliness feels moral while dirtiness feels shameful. Medieval programming achieved perfection by making itself invisible, converting social construction into natural truth, ensuring compliance through mechanisms that feel like common sense rather than imposed rules. The modern hygiene industry exists because medieval anxiety created massive market for products that address shame rather than actual hygiene needs. You don't need soap that kills 99.9% of bacteria. You need to not feel disgusted by your own body. You don't need 7 types of cleaning products. You need to not fear that neighbors will judge your household cleanliness. Medieval shame created modern markets worth billions, all selling solutions to anxieties installed centuries ago. The pandemic made medieval mechanisms visible briefly, revealing how quickly rational hygiene can become anxious ritual. Hand sanitizer shortages, compulsive surface cleaning, suspicion of anyone appearing dirty. Medieval contamination panic surfaced immediately when crisis created conditions similar to plague years. Turns out modern hygiene was always one pandemic away from medieval levels of ritualized fear. Here's what medieval hygiene control teaches us about power and freedom. The most effective oppression doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like common sense, natural truth, obvious conclusions everyone reasonable accepts. Medieval people didn't think they were installing behavioral control through chamber pot shame. They thought they were maintaining standards. We don't think we're perpetuating medieval surveillance through bathroom privacy. We think we're respecting dignity. The control mechanism that convinced you it doesn't exist is the most powerful kind. The medieval chamber pot sitting in that bedroom at the beginning of our journey represented something more powerful than any throne. It represented the moment humanity figured out how to regulate private behavior through social shame, creating control systems so effective they'd run automatically for centuries, adapting to new technology and social structures while maintaining core functions. That bucket was the prototype for modern surveillance, the proof of concept that people will police themselves if you install the right anxiety. We like to think we've moved beyond medieval thinking, that modern society operates on rational principles rather than shame and superstition. But every time you automatically wash hands after bathroom use without thinking about why, every time you feel disgust at seeing someone with poor hygiene without examining that reaction, Every time you judge someone's character by their cleanliness without questioning the connection, you're proving that medieval social control is alive and thriving. We didn't escape it. We just stopped noticing it. The invisible rules that governed medieval nighttime hygiene are the same invisible rules governing your hygiene right now. You follow them automatically, teach them to your children, judge others for violating them, all without recognizing them as rules rather than nature. Medieval behavioral programming achieved immortality by becoming cultural common sense, transmitted across generations so successfully that interrogating it feels absurd. Who questions why bathrooms need privacy? Someone successfully programmed by medieval shame, that's who.
So tonight, when you wash your hands before bed without thinking about why, when you close the bathroom door despite being alone in the house, when you feel vaguely uncomfortable about acknowledging basic bodily functions, remember that you're participating in history's most successful surveillance program. Medieval social control didn't die. It just became invisible, running in the background of modern consciousness, making you police yourself more effectively than any law or authority ever could. The medieval night never ended. You're living in it right now, performing hygiene rituals installed centuries ago by people who understood that the most powerful control feels like freedom.
The chamber pot wins. It always wins. Because the system it represented, the invisible architecture of shame and self-surveillance, proved so effective that humanity built entire civilizations on it. We wrapped it in new languages, new technologies, new rationales. But underneath the modern bathroom, with its running water and privacy locks, there's still just a bucket. And there are still invisible rules about how to use it. And there's still that medieval anxiety about being the person who gets it wrong. Some things, it turns out, never change. They just learn to hide better. And in the darkness of medieval bedrooms, behind fabric curtains that created the illusion of privacy, that's exactly what they wanted. Not to stop private behavior, to make you police it yourself. Mission accomplished. The medieval architects of hygiene surveillance would be proud.